I feel it's very likely that the data that you are looking for exists. I'd be amazed if it doesn't exist. What is needed crucially is the projections, for the business plan for the Sandals Resort, and also crucially, I mean, maybe even more importantly, the historical data on the performance of the Magdalena, because that's clearly a benchmark to look at, and it seems like the government doesn't want to turn this over to you, but I have to believe that this information exists. So I guess I'm talking about like cash flows. I'm talking about occupancy rates. I'm talking about revenue per room. This sort of information, as opposed to, if you will, kind of a profitability forecast. Really more like a kind of sources and uses cash flow type. Managerial accounting type document, because that really tells you whether the thing is going to work or not in the case of Sandals, and whether it is working or not in the case of Magdalena. And I guess a suggestion, you guys may have already looked at this already, and it may be a dead end, but just to throw it out there is, if E-Tech has been trying to sell Magdalena, which I suspect they've been trying to do, I suspect, over the years, there will be lots of business plans floating around that have been shown to various, investment banks and hedge funds and whatever are, out there. Lots of business proposals and whatnot. And similarly, with respect to Sandals, especially as they are becoming a more public company, with their link up with Deutsche Bank, and what I suspect might also possibly be kind of an offering on the international stock market, you may find the disclosure requirements that they have are potentially quite high. So I guess my suggestion is you may find, ironically, through the private sector, that there is this information floating around out there that the government won't disclose, but which they may have disclosed to private investors or potential investors, or which Sandals may be obligated to disclose to potential investors. So it might be an avenue to pursue in parallel with the request for information from the government, to see if that information, because it must exist. It has to exist. How could you go into a venture like this without some idea of what your assumptions are about what the profitability would be? So just a couple of ideas.
Thank you. The point was very well taken. Just to let you know that I have actually gone out to former colleagues working in the financial services sector, both in the UK and the US. I've had no responses as yet, but I'm hopeful. Afra, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Greg, that the Magdalena Grand is not for sale anymore. It was for sale in '06, and it dragged on for about 18 months. And eventually closed, and that's when the government stepped in, bought all the private sector shareholders of Vanguard, spent $45 million refurbishing the property, and rebadged it as Magdalena Grand. The People's Partnership spent $388 million with further refurbishments, which is how we got up to 573. But it's not for sale, it's under operation from a company called Hospitality Solutions International in Miami. That they're the management agents. I think there was some recent thing in the press about them looking for an international brand, an international badge to carry the resort forward. But it's not for sale anymore in that respect. I think hospitality might be on the way out, but that's about it. Thanks.
While I wait for someone else to, craft their question, the first thing I wanted to ask was this, with respect to what David had raised about doing things differently. Is tourism in Tobago a viable option for the economy and for diversification? Because I'm not sure if tourism actually makes money for the country.
I personally have great reservations about the Sandals model for Tobago, which is why I would like to see some numbers. If we could see the numbers, we could form a judgment. I am much more convinced that Tobago actually has a real value proposition in ecotourism, precisely because they have not developed yet to the extent that many of the other islands have. Yes. Well, just think about when we ourselves go on a holiday. It wouldn't be unreasonable to spend a couple hundred US dollars a day. So if we look at it on even that modest basis, with a couple thousand visitors on a regular basis, it is a significant amount of money relative to the Tobago economy.
If I could just add something, I think it's important to look at those from a technology point of view, in the way that technology is now disrupting the tourism sector, in terms of now you have Airbnb and stuff like that. So there are different models now that people are using to be able now to engage in going to a country. You don't have to now no longer have to go and book for a hotel. You can use Airbnb, and there are other technologies out there that you could use now to people who have extra rooms, spare rooms in their homes, or communities coming together to pool together resources. So there's a disruption that's taking place. So then for me at least, the question would be then was there a proper problem statement developed as exactly what needs to be done in Tobago? Is it tourism? And if it's tourism, is it a mega resort tourism? Or are there other models that exist given the disruptions taking place right now that could be used?
Let's say something. Did Massey themselves say that they're interested? All I heard was, what was in the papers was the premises saying that Massey expressed interest. And Government Life, they bought Marriott last year. And I don't think anything, they didn't give any sort of inclination getting involved with Sandals in their reports.
Okay, just to answer the question, I think it's a question of how you read the conversation. About 6 weeks ago, Massey's group CEO, as Mr. Gervais won 2 months ago, gave a very effusive, unsolicited hooray for the whole Sandals thing, about what an excellent idea it was, and how much foreign exchange it was going to make for the country, and how it was going to improve everybody's level of training in terms of hospitality and so on and so on. And it was kind of remarkable how he came out with that, out of the blue, in a situation where he was being interviewed about a general series of things. And he came out plumping for this one project. I took it like a sign. And my information is that both Massey and Guardian are in line to participate in this thing under a kind of situation where they'll be investing the money and leasing the property back to the government. That's my information. I mean, I can't say everything, but that's my information. So we'll see.
Yeah, the name is Oludari. I am asking, perhaps, I'm directing my questions more to David in a sense, but really the entire panel, right? Because I'm not quite sure what is our criteria of measurement of success in all of these economic equations that we have put forward. But in listening to David, I notice you have a human aspect dimension of it when you were looking into small micro enterprises and perhaps things spread across wider field, the kind of impact. So what is really the criteria one of measurement of the success? Is it just dollars and cents, or is it human potential and human development and different general things? And I wanted to throw this other idea a little further, because most of these conversations seem to take as a given that a capitalist approach to economic management of our resources is the ideal. And since you have been saying that we need to have assessment and all these things, have we taken a country assessment approach as to what is the best economic approach for our Twin Island Republic?
My background, as I explained, for quite a lot of years, decades, is in the purely capitalist financial sector. However, I also worked in the voluntary housing sector in the United Kingdom. So got a good understanding of the necessity of those who spend public money, yes, embracing financial and economic doctrines, but overlaying that with other considerations. So that when you make those other considerations, you make them in full knowledge that by taking this route, I know I am going to be taking a suboptimal route financially to this extent, let's say $5 million. But this is the social benefit I expect to get for it. And in my view, that has to be left to the politicians. I as a finance person, don't want to get into that. But I feel that the input of the finance people is essential to go alongside that. It shouldn't be as it is now, apparently, that you only take the social side and really don't give much concern to how much this thing is actually going to cost. Because the reality is, no matter how much money you have, it is finite. Even when we had loads of money, it was finite. So you had to make choices. So that in making the choices, what are the criteria do you apply? And I feel it's got to be a mixture of the two. Afra wants to- Okay.
I'll come with my background of monitoring and evaluation, which I'm also trained in the government for the last 10 years. And you look at the whole idea of value for money, and what do we mean by the term value for money? And value for money, you need to look at the whole total cost of everything, from the time you're starting to construct it to maintenance costs, but also value for money also touches on social value. And what is the social value supplement is going to bring to Tobago? And then you're looking at also at environmental and sustainable value. Whether or not it's going to be sustainable at the end of the day in terms of understanding the impact it may have on the environment and stuff like that. So those are things that we haven't heard about. I mean, we heard that Massey and Guardian seem to be interested in getting involved. They must have seen something, that documents would have been probably shown to them or something to make them see this is an viable monetary investment. But from a social, ecological, and environmental point of view, we haven't heard anything much exactly. And those are things that we need to be cognizant of in moving forward this. And then the fact of, if Sandals comes into Tobago in terms of such was happening with Antigua, now is a good example, and then they decide to close off for 5 or 6 months, the kind of impact it may have on the sector, and using it as a hostile tactic to be able to get more out of the government, which is again a learning from Antigua. So I think all these things needs to be taken into factor, not just, I mean, the monetary factor I think is one that David alluded to, but social, community-based factors, environmental factors, ecological factors, things that we haven't heard that needs to be taken into account in terms of Sandals or whoever it's going to be, in terms of how this is going to work in terms of Tobago as a whole.
Yeah, Ola Keller, just to speak with your question, you started off talking about the human aspect, which David mentioned. And then you asked the question about the socialistic or the non-capitalistic perspective in terms of regional development. And I want to touch, without getting into overly theoretical thing, I want to touch on how that relates to our research, what we found. So one of the questions we were examining, because I laid out the research proposal in my presentation, one of the questions we were examining is the whole human resource development perspective. In other words, what were the provisions for training and development and promotion and retention of people from the level of basic staff all the way up to management in these hotels? Going back to Trinidad Hilton has been there 55 years. What has been the history? What's been the track record in terms of the country? How have we developed our human resources? And interestingly enough, that was one of only, out of the 20-something questions, because there's about 20-something or 30-something questions really asked these people. We just broke it into a simple thing in this presentation. But out of those 20-something or 30-something questions, there were only 2 or 3 questions that they really made an attempt to answer, and that was one of them. And what was interesting is that ETEC told us that they actually have provisions in the agreement for Trinidad Hilton for all of those things I just spoke about. Those provisions exist. And the next half of the question is, what has been the outcome? And they have never kept any records. So in fact, we as people, you see, at a certain point, we have to stop. It's important to recognize the past and to recognize where we came from and the Middle Passage and a lot of those things. But at a certain point, we have to take responsibility for ourselves. It's 55 years now we're independent. And our people who are paid by us to take care of that, take care of public business, not doing the job, so they could barely tell us, Yes, there are clauses in the agreement for that. But we can't tell you any numbers about who was promoted and who was retained and who was sent to do a bachelor's or master's or whatever. We don't know. You're blocking Ola Keller from seeing me, eh? That's not right. You're blocking Ola Keller, yeah. So Ola Keller, that's the answer I could give you in context to the work we have done on this exercise. That in fact, some things were done, some things were in place. We have a deficit, to use a financial term to describe a human thing. We have a deficit in terms of how we manage our own stuff. And we need to be serious about that because we have not even kept figures and we can't even answer a basic question about how it was managed. So that's one thing that came out in the exchange Rishi had with Tech on the Trinidad Hilton question.
I just want to make one more point there. It reminded me, the discussion reminded me. We've actually already paid a price for this discussion about sandals. And the price we've paid is that it has literally sucked all the oxygen out of the room as regards discussing tourism in Tobago. There is no other tourism discussion going on in Tobago and hasn't been for over a year. At a time when Tobago tourism is in the doldrums, it's in the gutter. Yet we do not speak about it, we speak only about sandals. And that is a price that we're paying, in my view.
Yeah, good night. I'd like to thank everybody who was doing the research there and looking into trying to find these answers in the state. But it strikes me that this is par for the course, and that, you know, I guess none of you were really truly surprised by the answers that you would have got, because, you know, most of the public sector where you have the state involved in Trinidad and Tobago, you can't find information easily. I mean, in the whole energy sector, it's not possible to obtain a single contract that has been in place for very many years, decades sometimes. Many of those contracts are coming up for renewal. And or even this in the energy sector, we found out recently that the Auditor General cannot verify any of the amounts of gas that leave this country through Atlantic LNG. That has been going on for 17 years. So what I found about Trinidad, and the more that I think about it, our space, is that it's a room full of elephants, and that's the metaphor that I find myself sort of understanding my space in, and in fact those elephants fill the room, and the people become very small, and we have come to learn to negotiate our space within a room full of elephants, and I think that this particular one, I think we all remember the Hilton in Tobago was built with inferior materials, and people were paid up front. And it was a fiasco that went on, in fact, that hemorrhaged funds out of the state. And when everybody got paid, and at no risk, the state picked up the bill. And so I think what it shows clearly in Trinidad and Tobago is that we function as a corporate state where, let's say, economic interests drive development decision-making. And social interests and ecological interests don't sit at that table. Far less have sight of the agreements that the state enters into with private interests on our behalf. And I think that it's very clear now, after somebody mentioned how old we were, that after 55 years we campaign on public interest matters, but we govern or we serve special or private interests. And that's just how it is in Trinidad and Tobago. But what I wanted to say is that, like, if you look at policy, I mean, there's a scarcity of policy to serve public interests. Like the one that I mentioned about a month ago when Afra spoke before, that alarms me the most. And I'll just make this statement, and then I want to say something in particular about Sandals and Tobago. But we have had 3 successive generations of national environmental policy. Right? And I'm a water and sewage engineer or environmental engineer. whatever you want to call it. But I mean, that's the foundation. The resources, the physical resources of the state are essentially water negotiated, whether they're energy, whether they're water, whether they're land, as in the case of Sandals. But national environmental policy has gone through 3 policy documents. The first one in '98, which we sought to protect the environment. By 2006, we were managing, we changed the protection to the management of the resources. We were no longer protecting them, and we were managing them to preserve a balance between economic interests and ecological interests. In 2017, the 3rd iteration is happening right now. And one of the most alarming things about it is that it's removing a particular clause from the policy that spoke specifically to energy. And it spoke to energy because it's a finite asset, and it's the primary asset of the state through which we gain most of our rent and our income, etc., and that we pay for the lifestyles and conditions in Trinidad, right? Now, that national environmental policy has an energy clause, and that energy clause says, and it has never been invoked, but it existed for 10 years. It was invoked once in a legal case that challenged the Alutrint and the Alutrint smelter. And that clause says that if the state is going to invest and commit large quantities of finite assets, that it has to examine exactly what you guys are looking for, the cost-benefit of doing so. So we invoked that clause when we asked, well, why would you give a land concession to Alcoa, or why would you enter into an agreement and build Alutrint? Why would you give them gas? You know, why would you give them concessionary gas? And the energy clause requires that analysis. And it's a really important in the decision-making tool, because effectively the Environmental Management Authority makes triggers the decision of yes or no, at least in the way that we work, through this certificate of environmental clearance for large developments that have significant impact. So it's a very important portal and door, and that's the door that I've been standing and looking at for the last 20 years now. And what's interesting, in our 2017 policy revision, we have removed that clause. And so somebody is awake to the fact that that clause is a potential risk for scrutiny and assessment when these decisions are being made. And if you look at the Sandals model, it's very similar in its expectations of what the energy contracts have expected of Trinidad and Tobago's government in making Trinidad and Tobago the low-cost energy hub of the world, which it has been for methanol and ammonia and LNG for the last 20 years. And we have been extremely competitive, but at what cost? And that question has never been answered in the 10-year period that the National Environmental Policy had the energy clause. Okay, so let's go and look very quickly at Sandals and Tobago. The interesting thing from my perspective, and I've heard you, in terms of these cost benefits and scrutinies, is where will they get their water? Tobago is producing 10 million gallons a day of water from surface water, right? The Hillsborough Dam was never dredged for 20 years. There's always talk about dredging it, but when it comes down to having fellas go out there and dredge it, they could never agree of who to dredge, because there's always a lot of competition to get the contract. And politicians, they get giddy and they don't know who to give it to, and sometimes nobody gets it because everybody wants that contract to dredge the thing. But by dredging it, you would create storage for rainwater to provide for the 10 million gallons. But 2 years ago, Tobago hotels had to shut down because they had no water. You couldn't go in a hotel because there was nothing in the tank that they have outside. And the Corland River wasn't given what the Corland River was low. It didn't rain. You remember that? So now the state has, again, an arrangement, you could call it a public-private thing, to have a desalination plant. They love desalination plants in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a favorite technology because in the agreement is a take or pay. So if you get a desalination plant, whether they take it, they're still paying for the water. But nobody can afford the water in Trinidad that it costs to put it in your tap from desalination. And in Tobago, the desalination plant is supposed to produce 50% of the demand. Because when the hotel comes, 750 rooms, if you look at that water demand, it will be almost, in my view, equivalent to the existing water demand on the island. So the question is, who will pay for that? Now, we know that we can't pay for WASA's desalinated water in Trinidad, and WASA has a deficit of $8 billion. If you try to examine where did that deficit come from, so I'm rambling, but I want to try to say that, my reaction is that we are in a room full of elephants that nobody speaks about other than small fringe elements, the thinking man's blog or, some other people that I see on the table. But the truth is that we live in a mature province, which is a corporate state. And the energy assets are at the tail end of it. And, we're asking for transparency, we're asking for accountability, and we're asking for some form of regulation over what is left. And certainly the model of 750 rooms owned by a foreign interest, or 750 homes in Trinidad with a room to rent, providing a different model, the cost-benefit decision has to be made. Somebody has to do it. And I certainly welcome these types of events and these types of discussions. Thank you.
I'm pleased you raised the issue of the desalination plant, because it's been a major bugbear of mine. I remember Orville London, the then Chief Secretary of Tobago, about 3 years ago, telling us that the Hillsborough Dam was running at about 30% capacity. Now, if your major reservoir is running at 30% capacity, before you go spending lots of foreign exchange on a desalination plant, one would expect that we would first of all bring that up to proper capacity. How much of the deficit would that take care of? I don't know. But certainly I would have expected to hear about that first. If you drive around Tobago, you struggle to drive a half mile before you run into a leak of the mains in the road. Fix that first. So there are things that could be done. I don't know, I can't tell you, because they need to give us the figures. I can't tell you whether those two things would make up the shortfall, particularly if you then also have a sandals, because the water consumption, daily water consumption, I did a little bit of research. Average water consumption of a visitor to somewhere like Sandals is about 4 times the average water consumption of a normal resident. Yeah. So there's no disputing if we're going to be increasing the room stock, whether it's Sandals or anybody else, we need to supply the water. But I think that there are alternatives that we need to look at first. There's also the issue of the northeast of the island having an abundant supply of water. Is it no? You see, sometimes we say, when we ask for things, we say, but we're only a small island. Well, if we're only a small island, we could move water from the north to the south. And I am in total agreement with you. Before we spend that money, and that is money that we're going to be spending for another 20 years or 25 years that we'll be committed to, we need to evaluate the alternatives.
As we're counting cost, and that last statement about evaluating the alternatives kind of runs straight into my question. If not Sandals, what? Is there a viable option to Sandals in Tobago? And from a small, medium enterprise's point of view, what really is the opportunity cost of investing in Sandals?
Yes, there are alternatives. I will not even say there is an alternative, there are alternatives. But if the alternatives really ought to start with policy, so that developers know the broad environment, and when I say environment, I mean economic incentives, everything, into which they are going to be inserting themselves. I have put one forward because of my interaction with my clients and even some other people who are not my clients. And that is in the northeast of Tobago, what they have in mind is a world-class, I might even go so far as to say world-beating eco-environment with the concepts behind it shared by multiple relatively small developments. So not one large development, not on one big piece of land, across land occupying 4,000 acres, owned by various parties, but all conforming to a standard of development that is agreed in advance and which can become the image, the selling point of the whole area. And that's just the one I know about. And I know that there are other people who have been doing work as well. So there are alternatives, yes.
One quick question. Have these alternatives been presented to anyone at the THA or the Ministry of Tourism, etc.? Are they aware of these alternatives?
They are aware of an outline plan for one that I know personally of.
Okay, all right.
They've had no response.
Here and say that the entire project falls under the office of the Prime Minister.
Yes, the Prime Minister has taken over tourism in Tobago, which is a whole political issue because that is contrary to the Tobago House of Assembly Act. But I don't know if you want to go there now.
Good evening to everyone. Afra and the members of the panel, let me commend you on hosting this session this afternoon. Unfortunately, you did not advertise free doubles, so not many of us came. Just a few points. My son is actively involved in the hospitality business. In fact, he recently resigned from Magdalena Grand. After you were talking about what training, I would like to tell you that I worked for one of the automotive dealerships in Trinidad and Tobago, and my son worked at the Hilton in Trinidad before he went to Magdalena Grand. Trinidadians and every member of staff of those institutions can go online. Rishi spoke about disruptive technology. We don't have to come to class anymore. We can be home once we have an internet access, and we go on and we study automotive technology at the Honda Online University. My son was able to go online and study with Hilton International. He did so at Magdalena Grand as well. At 31 years old, when the position of food and beverage director became vacant at Magdalena Grand, he was considered to be too young and inexperienced to get the position, and a foreigner was employed, of course at a lot of money and a lot of benefits. My son held the position of food and beverage manager. Magdalena Grand is doing really, really bad. I'm surprised that they haven't shut down. The place is poorly maintained. I was there last week, Tuesday. And they seem to be thinking that some godmother, god fairy is going to come and rescue them. But that's not going to happen. I also I wanted to see, and maybe for the last time, because I don't know if I will live or if I could afford to visit Sandals. So I went to Sherborne's Point. That is the area called No Man's Land. It's a beautiful area. But I think what's going to happen is that this government, and after I came late, I'm sorry, I don't know what is the rough estimate of the cost of construction of this building for Sandals.
500 million US, about 3.5 billion Trinidad.
Thank you very much. I estimated something like 3 billion TT dollars, yes. And we're going to spend that money. And the exposure is exactly the same as Magdalena Grand. So, the marine environment. So, I imagine if we can't keep the Magdalena Grand, will Butch and his company be able to maintain No Man's Land? But that remains to be seen. What horrified me as I came into the meeting late is the responses from the state institutions and enterprises. I have a little business which I started when I retired 3 years ago. And the amount of reporting that I have to do and the amount of audits that are run on me, it's unbelievable, but these big institutions don't even have published financial statements, which is a basic requirement of doing business or running a company. And that some of us are prepared to leave that where it is, well, I think that says a lot. Thank you very much.
Rishi, what strategies for finding the information that you can't find?
Disclose. Thou shalt not know, 11 commandment, I was told. Right, yeah. No, there are strategies. I mean, I probably didn't get into it in terms of ETEC and UDCAT, but we are waiting. I'm waiting. UDCAT to come back to us with a reply again. Failure to meet whatever request that we want to get the information from UDCAT, then we will seek under the Act, you have the right to judicial review and to go to court to force them to give out the information. And similarly, ETEC actually came back to us and said that they need to speak to the external parties beforehand, which is allowed for also in the Act, before they can decide whether they're going to give us the information or not. So we've given them some space, but very soon, within a while, if we don't hear favorable responses for them, then obviously the other side of the coin will be to seek judicial review of both of all the FYs that we have sent, to force the court now to make a judgment call on this. And the good thing is, in our case, that we are also arguing on the point of public interest, which is a very important statute in our Freedom of Information Act. And it's very heartwarming, I guess, to know, if many people don't know, that we also have a lot of case law in our country with regards to freedom of information. And the courts seem to be very much liberal in their interpretation of the Act and the freedom of information. I mean, Afra could tell you from his days with JCC and also with the Ministry of Finance and the invaders behind the legal privilege that they try to invoke, and the whole public interest clause we have in Section 35 of the Act there. The court seem to be very liberal in interpretation of forcing government to give information.
Good evening to the panel. I would like to just join and commend the panel on the excellent research that was conducted regarding the sandals issue that has arisen recently. My issue with this entire debacle is that the transparency and the accountability in terms of what has been transpired so far with respect to the Memorandum of Understanding. The Prime Minister, he would have indicated that a Memorandum of Understanding was signed. There was no press release on the issue, neither from the Office of the Prime Minister or from Sandals themselves regarding the signing of this MOU. So now we are left to wonder what is contained in that document and who would be the major stakeholders that are involved, whether or not any feasibility studies were conducted, environmental impact assessments were conducted regarding the construction of the sandals industry in Tobago. So also, what was remiss is that there was one press release I remember reading from the Office of the Prime Minister where he indicated that several stakeholders, including himself, the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Tourism, met with the sandals team. But notably, any representative from the THA was absent from those negotiations. So that is my issue regarding this sandals deal in terms of the transparency of the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed. Also, to Mr. Maharaj, with respect to the FOI, an interesting judgment was delivered by Justice Budu Singh, where there was request for SEA scripts from the Ministry of Education, and they tried to cloud it on that it's the responsibility of CXC. So maybe that will be a very important judgment you can look at if you're willing to pursue the route of judicial review. Thank you.
Rhoda, if I could just make 2 points, if the chair will allow it. First of all, to the gentleman, like yourself, I'm a citizen of the Republic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Novak George. I have none of the learning, training, or the headache of the gentleman to my right. They call me to help them, so I help them. Everyone, for clarification, keep something in mind. all ministers serve at the Prime Minister's pleasure. They are all ministers in the Prime Minister's office. There is no distinction that needs to be made between any of them, with the exception of the Attorney General, who is also a creature of the Constitution. The rest of them are completely interchangeable, which is why you can have a thing called a cabinet reshuffle, which is a completely meaningless political exercise. So keep that in mind. I begin there because, for those of you who came in late, Afra referred to, at the top of his comments, to a public meeting in Tobago, which was a political meeting of the PNM. It was not a meeting of, it was not a workshop, it was not a public discussion of the tourism sector or hotel plant and capital investment. It was not a meeting of the THA. Yeah? This is a political meeting of a political party in which the Prime Minister was announcing national policy. Right? And get our facts straight. This is not unusual in Trinidad, but we have to ask ourselves, is this really acceptable? Because these are far-reaching consequences. And I'm not understanding how the boards of directors of Massey and Guardian Group don't call in their management team to ask, why is the Prime Minister calling our name in a political meeting? So you have to understand where the handshake really is. For those of you who came in late, let me reiterate something. Guardian Group is part of the disaster called Magdalena. And they were financially bailed out. Speaking of bailouts, we do bailouts in Trinidad all the time. It is not unique. The mega bailout of CL Financial is of a kind because of its scale. But we do this all the time. The government gets into partnership with private companies. The private partners don't do their part. They go around the back of the chair. They make an agreement. They take their share out. They underperform the contract. There are no consequences, or none that we can find, because the FOIs are still out there. And now that same Guardian Group that is part of the debacle called Magdalena we're being told via a political meeting that the Guardian Group is coming in to help on the investment of sandals. What are we learning? What are we learning? Zero is a place on the number line. Huh? I tell people all the time, failure is an option. Failure is an option. Failure is a data point. And Magdalena has failed to be, the Hilton is a damaged performer. Yeah? How much money to date? $600 million. In repairs, going on interminably. A sitting chair. None of you in this room, I don't know many of you, but I doubt any of you can go before a board and say, or to owners in an annual general meeting and say, I don't know when the repairs will come to an end. I spent over $500,000 today. Take that. Which one of you can do that? And this man has come before the Parliamentary Select Committee, yeah, a place of responsibility, and basically has shrugged his shoulder at the taxpayer. Yeah, he's still there. He's still the chairman. And for the record, I'm not the kind of citizen who wants him to go. I'm not like Rhoda. I don't. Yeah, that was coming. I don't want to be like Rhoda. I'm not going to be like Rhoda. I don't want him to go. I don't want someone to resign for wrongdoing and shenanigans. Stay there and do the work. I want to see the citizens cause somebody to experience correction in place. Correction in place. I want you to feel, what did Kendrick Lamar say? Be humble. Sit down. Do your work. When your term is up, then we'll let you go. But we need people who are in place to do their job. And Prime Minister is no different on this score. He can't come to a public meeting to talk about national policy involving private partners, and none of them are accountable. This is part of the disaster we're facing here. So consider that. I'll pause, because like the gentleman down there, I was at the other meeting too, and these things are fractious, they are complex. The issues involving the FY, Rishi has told you enough of the story to make you feel scandalized, but if you read the details of the responses from state agencies, you can't believe that these people are working on behalf of the Republic and treating our request for information with scant courtesy, even odium. You know, how dare you want to know anything about how your country functions? How dare you want the information? You're out of place. And of course you are. Of course you are.
Good evening, everyone. Janica Mears is my name. I got here a bit late, so I don't know if this was addressed earlier. What has been the role of the THA in this project? There was a reference earlier about the Honorable Prime Minister managing it from his office, but it's inconceivable to me that the THA never had a say in the matter.
I have to take a deep breath before I answer this one. Because those who know me know that the people in the THA and I are not the best of friends. Nobody who spends $20 billion of my money and refuses and has failed to produce an audited statement could be my friend. It's over 10 years, I think it's about 14 or 15 years since they last produced an audited statement. And in fact, I think it was when
2004, I believe, is the last year.
I think it was when Charles was in office.
Okay, all right.
That's how long ago it was. Yep. So as to the role of the THA has sat there, firstly under Orville London and now under Charles, and allowed the Prime Minister to walk all over the THA Act, which says categorically that tourism in Tobago is under the control of the THA. Could you imagine if Kamala had done that? But you see, it shouldn't matter who did it. All that should matter to him was that Tobago is being disadvantaged and that the authority that they had fought so long and hard for is being taken away from them. And he ought to have defended Tobago, and it should be the THA in charge of this. Now, you see, I'm struggling to understand also the motive of the Prime Minister. I am struggling to understand the motive or his understanding of how things get done. The Prime Minister could have remained in charge of this. He didn't have to put himself in front. You leave Orville London in charge of it, but you call in the shots. That's how we know it's worked all along. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right way, but I do not understand why the Prime Minister took the decision to openly flout the THA Act when he didn't need to. I just don't understand that. But beyond that, I am very, very concerned on behalf of the THA and all of Tobago, and let me just broaden it a little bit. What is happening here reminds me, and I'm old enough, reminds me of the post-colonial period. When Eric Williams and his people took control of the government from the British, they found themselves saddled with a lot of agreements that had been put in place with Tate and Lyle and all the others that very much tied the hands of the incoming government. I am seeing echoes of that in the kinds of arrangements that are taking place now, almost in anticipation of the greater self-government being handed to Tobago. So, for example, by the time they get this greater internal self-government, they would have the biggest economic activity on the island, namely sandals, predetermined for them. No opportunity to determine how much tax is received from this economic activity. They would have had a desalination plant imposed on them, for which they will pay for the next 20 years in foreign exchange. And another thing, I will close on this particular issue with one further point that troubles me. The sudden decision to grant borrowing capacity to the THA. Is that tied in with this whole sandals thing and the fact that they're about to get internal self-government? I pose it as a question. Tobago has no financing. Tobago's total income is about 300 million of the 2-point-something billion that they spend. You will have to, I'm afraid I can't answer that. We will have to ask. Yes. Hmm? Okay.
Hi, good evening. Brian Frontin, the Trinidad Hotel Restaurants Tourism Association. I just have, after we've been talking about this conversation for a while, Rishi, as well on the tourism front, and it's a very more rhetorical question in terms of what is the role of the state in operating hotels? It's a very broad statement I'm going to put out there. It has many answers. I can postulate one being without a sound tourism or investment policy, you need to be the one moving first money to get people to buy into your destination, being one that may be viable. I think there's a direct correlation between the state's continuation of investing into hotels and the lack of a performing tourism policy or master plan of any sort that would allow private capital to do that heavy lifting, and the state being therefore in charge more of environmental or land holding leasing, which may be therefore captured under a use or land use policy to say how many sites are approved, what is the impact, what is the desired earnings from the rental, as opposed to getting into long-term debt, getting into the performance management risk of whether the hotel is performing. You have all the different models of whether you're taking lease payments versus share of profit at the end. It's very complex. And the question is, somebody raised it earlier, does the state have the expertise resident in some of these holding management companies? This is what these SPVs are. These SPVs aren't hotel-specific companies. They are literally either construction-focused or asset management. And that's about it. Everything else is either brought in by way of consultants or otherwise on a temporary basis. But the active management of these plants as an asset manager or owner is a very complex and very professional competence. So I would leave it very broadly at what is the role. I would like to separate, of course, that the brands that are currently operating in these state assets are international brands of very good repute. They do report data, I might say, on the general occupancy trends that the hotels experience, and that's where the Hotel Association has aggregate data on the income earned from the hotels, at least in Trinidad. We don't have any reporting hotels in Tobago, as well as their occupancy aggregate for destination Trinidad for at least 1,500 of the 2,500 rooms. That's about a 60% average. So we do know some degree of performance data at the private sector level. How it impacts the commercial underlying arrangements of each of those different plans that the government has an interest in is different. As we know, the lease for Hilton is completely different from a owned, managed asset of the Magdalena, where you take all the risk in terms of the state pays all the bills. In the case of Hilton, it's different. In the case of Hyatt, it's different. So we must examine them on their own legs. But I'm just generally putting the question out of, should the state continue to play a role? This is probably one of the few states, I think, that has this degree of, might I say, all the largest hotels in Trinidad and Tobago are state-owned or managed. That is an unusual anomaly. No other Caribbean destination has that. So we're talking about 902, maybe 1,100 rooms in Trinidad and Tobago, government-owned and facilitated. That's not the norm anywhere else in the region.
Thank you very much for a number of very valid points. And one that you raised that is close to my heart is the issue of whether governments should be involved in the owning of hotels. And for me, it goes beyond that. If you look around in Tobago, we also have the issue of shopping malls. There's only one major private shopping mall in Tobago. All the other shopping malls are built and managed by the state, and they are all failures. So that I certainly concur with you that we really ought to be examining what economic sectors the state ought to be so actively involved in, given their track record. And Correct.
We have another question.
Hi, good evening to the panel. It's not really questions, but 4 points I want to speak about. One being, well, just coming on from the same question about state involvement in hotels. I want to know where did this model originate of having the state invest in terms of providing the physical infrastructure and then having a private operator? Is this something that developed in Trinidad, or did we copy it from somewhere else? Is there any way of benchmarking to see, okay, this has happened somewhere else and it's worked successfully, that therefore we adopted it? That's one, right? Second, directly for Rishi, going back to the presentation, you spoke about freedom of information and trying to get information from the BIR in terms of tax payments, and the response being that it was exempt because it's financial information. And you stated that you disagreed with that. I just want to know if there was any follow-up, because you indicated with the other cases that you did follow up and get further responses. Thirdly, is it David in the middle? Right. You were speaking about a counter-proposal in terms of, if not sandals, dealing with multiple local, small-scale accommodation providers. But I want to throw something in the spanner there, in the works there, because you hear a lot that the problem with Tobago is compared to other Caribbean destinations, is that Tobago is not as well known as Barbados, as Antigua, as BVI, all these other places that attract tourists quite easily from Europe and the States. So the argument is popularly made that we need a big name brand to attract foreign tourists, and this alternative of multiple small local providers, even if it may have more direct benefits for local people, is not going to solve the problem we have image-wise in terms of attracting tourists from Europe and the USA. So I wanted your take on that. And finally, I want to play devil's advocate, because the whole discussion in terms of the state, what we get out of these arrangements, in my understanding, we've been talking about direct benefits in terms of we have invested so much in terms of capital and maintenance of the facilities and whatever. And in return, what are we getting in terms of, do we get any money from the operator, in exchange for that, kind of direct between owner-operator arrangement. But, a lot of people who would want to defend these things would speak about the indirect benefits of tourism, which you can't easily measure in terms of, okay, if we have a sandals, it's going to provide opportunities for the local furniture maker to supply, it's going to provide opportunities for someone to cook, someone to have a cleaning job, the taxi driver will have, business transporting people, the fruit vendors, craft people, coconut vendor on the savannah, if you're talking about Hilton, et cetera, right? So people will, I can see easily people trying to defend this by saying you can't look directly, narrowly at just the direct benefits between state owner and private operator, but you have to look at the bigger picture. So those are my 4 points.
Okay, the first question, which was about the model of the state building and owning the properties, it's a model that exists widely elsewhere, okay? So when you analyze and you look at the big groups, the big hotel groups in the world, so I think in the case of Hilton, I forget the exact number, but Hilton is like one of the world's best known brands. They have hundreds of hotels. And I think the amount of hotels that actually belong to Hilton is less than 20. Okay, that's the model that they use all over the world. So if you own a property in Las Vegas and you're putting up a casino and you want a place for your guests to stay, so they're kind of captive, so they go upstairs after they've had too much to drink and they go back downstairs and they gamble, you enter a deal with your property with some major hotelier to put up a 4-star or 5-star thing that will complement what you are doing. And that is how Las Vegas is really built. There's no hotel company is really putting their money to build a hotel. It's a widespread model, okay? In terms of nations, Trinidad and Tobago made a foray in 1862 with Hilton in Port of Spain here, okay? And it was successful in that we got a major brand into the country on the fringe of the savannah, and it was like a kind of a landmark project. And it also coincided with independence and a whole lot of other important points intersected. And it's continued as a model because you have enough money in the country that allows us to find the money from the treasury to design and build and fit and furnish. The other Caribbean countries don't have that amount of money. So all they've been able to do is to provide a parcel of land, or make a parcel of land available, make the approvals available, and the foreign hotelier will come in and put up the hotel, in return for which they get these tax concessions. Trinidad and Tobago has an interesting paradox. I see Brian in the back, I see Denise here. And the interesting paradox we have is that one way of looking at the whole model question, which you raised, Camille, the one way to look at the model question is that, in fact, you could say that it's either the host is building the hotel, and in which case, if the host builds the hotel, the other person comes in and operates the hotel, and you split the money. The hotelier operates it. Or the other way, the hotelier builds the hotel, and you give them a tax concession if you're a state. But in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we have the best of both worlds, according to how you want to look at it, like Charles Dickens. He said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We have a world in which we are building the hotels. We design, we build, we fit, and we furnish. We put the person in, and we have tax concessions contained in our Tourism Development Act. So in fact, we are giving them, it's in Trinidad and Tobago, it's possible to eat your cake and have it. And these are the kind of things we have to be aware of to get down to it. Rishi.
With regards to your second question, with regards to BIR, and if you would go onto our website, www.polywatch.info, there's a link to all the FOIs and all these sponsors that we've gotten so far. I think I didn't put in BIR, but I will address that and then put in the BIR stuff, all the FOIs and all the sponsors and the back and forth and stuff like that. If you look at the BIR response, interestingly enough, it was crap. In terms of it was wrong in law and wrong in substance, and we did go back to them to get some verification. There has been a tit and forth with BIR, as with most of the other agencies, in terms of haggling to get the information, because again, they seem to go back to the same model, default model of, and this is something, like Rhoda mentioned before, I was actually senior officer in charge of the FI unit from 2007 till 2009, 2012. I worked with the FOI Act from since 2006 to 2012. And in terms of the administrative reporting and stuff like that, and you'll always be fascinated when you would get phone calls from ministries or from legal officers say, hey, we've got enough freedom of information requests. So you call in the unit, say, okay, cool, what's the problem, what situation you want us to guide you with? How not to give out the information? I'm not joking. I remember even meeting ministers, former administrations, current administration, both sides of the spectrum, and when they come out for introduction to revenues, they say, well, okay, I work with the FOI Act. Oh, okay, you work with that Act. Okay, so if somebody asks X, Y, Z, we have to give it to them. It seems to be a default mode, and it's something that's really troubling in terms of legal officers, people working who knows the law, who knows responsibility of ministries and organizations, not wanting to give all the information. Interestingly enough, when the committee last week in November, I'm off to Argentina because the Open Government Partnership is having its Regional Americas meeting, and I've been invited on behalf of Disclosure today to make a presentation. It's going to be on freedom of information and the role it plays in government transparency in the Caribbean. As far as I can see from everything I experienced over the years, is that even though you had the FOI Act and talked about transparency, openness, accountability, government seems to be more, as Novak said, the 11th commandment, thou shalt not be found out. There seems to be that undesirable need to give out information. One, I think it also comes from the fact that sometimes you just don't collect the information. They just don't have the data to requisite. And that also is a big problem with government. In that, I've worked in the public sector for 12 years before I left. And the problem of proper records management, document management systems, being able to have your records management system in place, either electronically or hard copy, being able to collect data, knowing what kind of data, what kind of information you need to collect to be able to analyze, to be able to monitor, to be able to do proper reports, to evaluate, stuff like that. Data collection and those kinds of things, it's something that's poor, not only in ministries, but also in state agencies. It's a real problem that I think we face, and I think it's something we need to address seriously in order to be able to be a more open government on the whole.
Just two features of that before David answers there. One is that we don't measure anything in Trinidad. So if you go to a public clinic, it could be anywhere, it could be in Diego Martin, it could be San Juan, it could be Shogunas, and you ask, how many patients do you all see on average for a day? They don't know, and they can't guess. And if they had a guess, they won't tell you, because what you want to know that for. And at the back of their mind, the reason you want to know that will put me at a disadvantage. There is something cultural in the belly of the beast that just knows, if they know this, and I didn't know it, they now have one on me, whatever that means. And that's real. To your point about the whole knock-on domino effect of the economic intersections of everyone who benefits from, if you build a major plant, major infrastructure, everyone downwind of it benefits. Yeah, that's one model. And then when the plant decays, everyone downwind of it, their benefit decays too. So that's the problem. It's like a poison chalice. So that's something to consider. And everything that you want to manage, you have to figure out how to measure it. Because if you can't measure it, you don't know how well it's performing. So anyone who's walking around glorifying how anything is performing, from Atlantic LNG to a coconut vendor, if you can't measure your outputs, your inputs, you don't know what kind of cake you're baking.
I want to pick up on those 2 points, if I may. Firstly, about the downstream. I certainly agree that there are potential benefits downstream with most projects. But we must also not ignore that there are also potential negatives downstream that also should not be ignored. So for example, with sandals, the assumption has been that all the other hoteliers will do well. Is that correct? On what basis are we assuming that to be correct? And so on for all the other players in the market. Now, with respect to the branding, I am going to speak on behalf of the project that my clients are interested in doing. Given modern technology, given the disruptive nature and the disruptive potential of that technology, given that there is not, in my view, a significant competitor in that space in the region, I believe that the plans that they have put together could very well carve out that space for them on the international scene and allow them to be unique across the entire Caribbean, rather than getting into the race with everybody else who's been doing that kind of racing for the last 20 years while we've been sitting on the sidelines. So it's partly about innovation, which is something I love, but I think there is sufficient basis for it because ecotourism is not new internationally. So it already exists, there is already a name for it, and we have, if you like, the raw materials upon which to build.
Okay, well, gentlemen of the panel and ladies and gentlemen of the audience, we've been here for 2 hours and plus, and I think we've had a very, very wide-ranging and penetrating discussion. I want to invite Afra to make a summation statement, and then we can, not a long statement, Afra, and then we could always take it up, informally elsewhere.
Okay, thanks, Rhoda. And thanks, colleagues, for coming along and supporters. This is just an attempt to present some provisional findings from our research. It's in response to the criticism that is made sometimes that, in fact, you can't talk about that because you don't know all the facts. And you can't write about this because you don't know what you're writing about. And you're only asking a set of questions because it's rhetoric and so on. And Dr. Rowley made some comments about it. I won't go into what those comments are. But the reality is, when you think about knowledge and how we know and what we come to know what we know, you never really know all about anything. I don't mean to sound philosophical, you never really do. It's a quest. We are involved in a quest trying to find out basic information about how these important investments work. I'd worked out something on the back of an envelope earlier on. And the 3 state-owned hotels, the total amount of capital invested from my calculations, information in the public domain, is $1,843 million. That is over 1.8 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars involved in those first 3 projects. And we're looking at a 4th project that could be in the order of $3 to $3.5 billion. And then I take us back to the principle that public money ought to be managed to a higher standard than private money. And then I ask myself the question, Ray, you asked about Neil and Massey, and I'm going to tell you what I think about it. I ask myself the question whether a bright man like Gervais Warner, and Gervais, I hope you're watching this. Gervais is a former partner of McKinsey, one of Trinidad and Tobago's bright men. Whether he would go to his board, would he go to his board and say, gentlemen, I want to do a 4th investment in this type of product. You already have 3 running. No, I don't know how much money they make every year. I don't know what's the rate of profit. I don't know what's the rate of return for each employee. I don't know what's the market share. But I think we should make a 4th one because it's a good fit and it's a good place for Neil and Massey to put its capital. And of course, we know that somebody like Gervais Warner or Mr. Lockjack, heaven prevent, wouldn't make an investment like that. And if they wouldn't do it, why should we? I'm not saying that we can't have Sandals or we can't have development in Tobago. I'm not against development in Tobago, whatever that looks like ultimately. But if we're doing development and we're embarking on these large-scale projects, we have to take account of the costs and the benefit. We have to take account of the human element, as Ola Kayla mentioned. We have to take account of what is the model we're using going forward and have proper standards looking at what it is we're doing. So thank you for your attention. The work will continue. There's at least one of the cases, I think it's ETEC, where we've issued a pre-action protocol and we are litigating that one. And the other 3 may end up there. We hope not. They may end up there. We're prepared to go to that length to get the information, to inform the decisions for the development. Thank you.